very good evening to everyone, and welcome to the last session of the Global Finance Conclave 2021 for day 2. In this session, I have with me, I should introduce myself as well. My name is Amlan Gupta. I'm an associate professor at the School of Banking and Finance. And I have along with me the co-chairperson for this session, Professor Chavi Asrani. This session, we are going to talk about resilience in society. And this is obviously one of the topics which is foremost in the minds of all of us, since we are just trying to recover from a serious shock to society, to the economy, to the globe, in fact. And so we are very, very fortunate to have with us Professor Markus Brunnermeier. And he's going to talk to us about his very recently published book, The Resilient Society, which is the main theme of this session. So to introduce him, I'm going to invite Professor Asrani to please take over the screen.
Thank you, Professor Dasgupta. We at JSPF, JGU are very pleased to have with us Professor Markus for this special book discussion on his very insightful book, The Resilient Society. Professor Markus is the Edward S. Sanford Professor for Economics at the Princeton University and Director of Princeton's Bendheim Center for Finance. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, a research associate at National Bureau of Economic Research, the Center for Economic Policy Research, and the member of the Bellagio Group on International Economy. He is a Solon Research Fellow, Fellow of the Econometric Society, Guggenheim Fellow, and the recipient of Benance Prize granted for outstanding contributions in the field of macroeconomics and finance. He is a member of several advisory groups, including to the US Congressional Budget Office, the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, the Federal Reserve of New York, the European Systematic Risk Board, and the Benz Bank. Professor Brunnermeier was awarded his PhD by the London School of Economics. His research primarily focuses on international financial markets and the macroeconomy, with special emphasis on bubbles, liquidity, financial and monetary price stability, and digital money. After the COVID-19 outbreak, he established this very unique series, the webinar series called the Markus series, and lots of discussions of this Markus series are mentioned in his book, The Resilient Society. I now invite Professor Markus to share with us about, some of the insights which are given in his book, The Resilient Society.
Thanks a lot, thanks a lot, Professor Asrani and Professor Dasgupta. It's a pleasure to be with you and be with the Global Financial Conclave in India. And what I want to do is give a little bit of opening remarks, an overview of the book, and then we go to a discussion, and I'm looking forward to it. And hopefully you have a lot of questions. So let me use a little bit of slides about the book. And as Professor Asrani mentioned, it's based to a large extent also on my webinar series, where I got a lot of insights from various economists and policymakers, and I tried to condense them around the theme of a resilient society. So what we actually have recently, we have, a lot of shocks we might be facing. So we have the pandemic now, we might have future pandemics, or we might have antibiotic resistance, financial crisis, cyber attacks, natural disasters. And we have uncertainties with new technologies coming along too. And typically when there's a crisis, the crisis comes rarely alone, it comes in pairs or triplets. And so we have to figure out how to manage such a world. And resistance is typically futile. So you don't want to have a resistance approach. You really would like to have an approach where you can bounce back. And resilience is all about bouncing back. And it's about being flexible and agile and reacting to things. And I would like to contrast resilience first with some robustness approach. That's what the book does. So what is not resilience? So one thing you might say, oh, stability is all about rigidity, being very rigid or robust. But robustness is about being very strong and withstand any shock, and essentially being fault tolerant. So you can block off any of the shocks. And it's a little bit like an oak. So if you have a tree like an oak, you know, it stands very still. There's a wind coming here and there, but you don't fall over. It stands very rigid. While resilience is all about bouncing back. If there's a shock, you might be hit, but you bounce back. So it's a little bit like a reed. It's constantly swinging back and forth and bouncing back. And it goes, you know, to the French writer in the 17th century. He used this comparison where the reed essentially seems so volatile and so weak. But at the end of the day, when the wind is very, very strong, the oak falls over and can't get back up, and the reed gets back up. And the reed then in this poem says to the oak, I bend, I bow, but I do not break, because the oak breaks and cannot come back. So there's a robustness barrier where this, you know, the oak breaks, but the reed is not. And we should be more like a reed, constantly being flexible. It seems very risky, but it's not as risky as being very rigid. And it's a little bit like the volatility paradox. So it seems very volatile, but it's not as volatile as a low volatility environment. So, but for this, we have to have redundancies. We have to redundancies which we can redeploy very flexibly and all this. So resilience is not robustness or rigidity. So what resilience is also not avoiding risk at any cost. So risk is a very static concept. It's like if you think about mathematically, it's about variance or standard deviation, you know, the distribution. Resilience is a dynamic concept. It's like you hit and then you bounce back to a new normal. And so in mathematical terms, it's about mean reversion. And so it's a different concept from risk management as well. And you see it most closely if I compare now two paths here. One is, you know, there's this dashed line here. It's riskless. There's no risk at all. And there's another one which is more risky, but it has occasionally a crisis thing, but it comes back, it's resilient. So it's resilient, but in the long run, you would be much better off if you go for the resilient part, even though it's risky. So we shouldn't avoid risk at any cost. We should go for some risky thing as long as the risk is resilient. So we have to really look for risk and classify them as resilient and non-resilient. And I think that's very important what the book outlines. So what are the risks which are not very resilient and the resilience destroyers? What are resilience destroyers? And I identify three. One is traps. That's essentially when you're hit by a shock. Let's suppose you're very poor. If you're hit by an income shock, you're hit by, you know, poverty trap. You can't get back out. So poor people are much less resilient because they have a poverty trap. So in general, traps are very much things one has to watch out for because they kill essentially the resilience, they destroy the resilience of people. Another non-resilience and the resilience destroyer are feedbacks. Now you hit a feedback and then actually there's an adverse feedback loop that makes things worse and worse and worse. And a third of a resilience destroyer is like a tipping point. And you see it in this figure as well. So let's suppose you go down here and then you hit a tipping point and then the whole system spirals out of control. So that's essentially another thing we really have to watch out for. So let's not watch out for risk. Let's watch out for resilience destroyers. That's the message of the book. So that's essentially very important. The second message is, you know, resilience is talked about a lot already in the psychological literature. We said, oh, how are individuals resilient? Are they bouncing back? You know, when you're hit by a personal crisis, can you bounce back? That's one level of resilience, but there are different levels. Resilience at the individual level, which is very, very important and is, you know, touching a lot on psychology and other aspects. But then there's also resilience of systems, like probably we'll talk about global value chains or networks or, you know, the grid of electricity grid and all these things. These are systems that can be resilient when they are shocked from outside. But then there's also resilience of the society. And what makes the resilience of the society slightly different? Of course, if individuals are not resilient, then the society is not resilient either. So that's, you know, an important ingredient for society to be resilient. But, you know, this about the interaction of people, and people have beliefs and they have expectations and they have expectations what others will do. And it's about endogenous reactions of others. So let me give you a little example. There are two people here, person A and person B. The person A does something and it causes a negative externality or some negative spillovers on person B. Now the person B suffers from that. He's doing something and the other person, the person B, is suffering from that. Now that's an externality. In economics, we really try to avoid or to set up a society to minimize externalities. But what it's even more important is how will person B react to that? Okay, that's, the reaction function is really important. It could be that person B reacts to it and does something which causes an externality back to person A. And then the person A is reacting even more, and then it causes more externality. So if you combine feedbacks with externalities, or strategic complementarities as we use in eco-language, then it's actually really much more dramatic. And the question is, how can we set up a society to minimize these externalities, in particular these feedback externalities? And for this, we have a social contract, and the social contract is governed by social norms. So that's where we police each other by just behaving in a particular way to minimize externalities and feedback externalities. But we also have laws where the government enforces certain behaviors or reaction functions or non-reaction functions. Or we also have markets where you can trade some certain pollution permits and other things to minimize externalities. So these are then, how should you set up the society to minimize these externalities? And that's essentially what then, with this mind frame, I go then through various policy aspects. So one is, of course, health. With COVID, what can you think besides health? And how should you develop vaccines or not vaccines? And how important it is that you actually not only try to contain the crisis, but also develop in parallel a strategy which helps you to bounce back to a new normal. Or like developing a vaccine, you can go back to a new normal. Then there's a whole aspect on the macroeconomy. What does it mean if the interest rate is very low? Like in many advanced economies, the real interest rate is very low. That gives us more fiscal space. So the governments have more space to spend. But it also means for the central banks, there's less space because they can't cut the interest rate so much before they hit the zero lower bound because we can't go much negative. So there's the space, the policy space is moving. So it gives you more resilience in one dimension, but less resilience in the other dimension. Then there's a whole aspect about how to create a financial system which makes the economy, the society more resilient. So, for example, debt restructuring. So if somebody is hit with a shock, the poor person, he has some debt, now he's hit by a shock and he cannot back, do you let him get out of it? What's the debt restructuring mechanisms we have? The bankruptcy code. It's very, very important for resilient society. Otherwise, people suffer from debt overhang problems. And that you never get out of the recession, you never bounce back. So we have to design this cleverly way. And there should not be, if you go bankrupt, perhaps not so much a stigma attached to it because you don't allow people to come back out. You can think about the international monetary system, how much flexible exchange rates provide additional resilience and why not when it does. The book discusses that as well. You can go further into finance. You can think about distributed ledger technologies, or we can think about global value chains. Before the crisis, it was always focused on just in time, no redundancies, no buffers at all. Now, perhaps we have to think much more about just in case. If something happens, we might want to introduce some stress tests of global value chains, like what we do for the financial system, for financial institutions. We do stress tests. Let's do it for global value chains as well. And then the last part of the book is mostly about geopolitics. It goes into quads and all this China, US aspects, the global role of the dollar. And then there's a chapter on climate change, because climate change is also a tipping point. There are many tipping points in our climate. If things go worse, you can't come back. So these are non-resilient shocks. And for that, we have to watch out in particular. And then, we have to define what is sustainability is. If you're resilient, does it mean automatically that you're sustainable, that the situation is sustainable? It's not enough. You need resilience plus that you don't have an adverse trend. So you can have a riskless drift downwards, and that's not sustainable because you go down and down and down. So let me conclude with that. So that's a quick outline of the book. It has 4 parts, starting with this more abstract thing, which I try to cover now, the society and resilience. Then it goes into how to manage, in particular, the COVID crisis from a health aspect, and the whole macro dimensions and the whole global dimensions, focusing very much on emerging economies in this part and also the international geopolitics. So with this, I'm looking forward to the discussions, and thanks again for giving me this opportunity to be part of your event.
Thanks, Professor Brunnermeier. This was extremely useful and summarizes everything that we have read very nicely. So let me kick off the discussion, basically. While reading this book, of course, there are so many different concepts and ideas that were new to me, the things that I hadn't thought about. It got me thinking in different ways, and most of the time, actually, I spent trying to apply those ideas to India, basically, because I am here, and it's sort of made a lot of sense to me in some cases, and then I was wondering about certain other things. So that is one of the aspects that I want to discuss with you. First up, let's start with this idea that you showed us right at the beginning with the banyan tree, or I don't know if it's a banyan tree, but whenever we think of strength, we sort of think about a banyan tree in India. So that and the reed, right? So resilience, of course, is something that I completely understand the importance of this, but I somehow got the sense that this is something that we can choose. And then when I look at the reality of situations, then I suddenly feel a bit inconfident as to whether we actually have that choice, right? So if a society or an economy cares about resilience, is it possible to choose a path which is less robust, more resilient, and or is it something that is chosen for us by default? I know some things can be changed, but there must be fundamental, its history, its culture, all these things will matter. And the other aspect which I would like your comment on is how do we figure out where we are at in terms of resilience? Is there any way we can measure it? So I'll just give you a very odd example, which actually came up in a session a few sessions back. We were talking about the dissonance between the capital markets and the real economy in India, where our economy has obviously been badly affected by this pandemic, and we went into a recession, basically. So, but at the same time, the capital markets continue to do quite well, and in fact, the price earnings ratios on average has been actually better than most other markets all over the world. And one of our panelists was telling me that this is perhaps because the Indian markets are more resilient. And then I was thinking about this session that's going to happen later on, and I thought that I would ask you about this. So how do we actually figure out where we are at in terms of resilience? And the other thing is it possible to choose truly whether we are going to be a more resilient society or a robust society?
Very good point. So let me just try to address them a little bit. So can we choose it or can we not choose it? So there are two things I would say. A lot of our resilience is driven by social norms, so how we behave, and culture, as you mentioned, and other elements, identity, and the social norms are very slow-moving things, so don't radically shift. So in a sense, you might say it is chosen by society, but in a slow motion. So if there's suddenly a crisis like the COVID crisis, you cannot just change your social norms. So if you, for example, whether you wear a mask or whether it's socially, can you walk on the street without mask or can you walk on it? It depends very much on the country. If you look at Japan, no government had to enforce that you have to wear a mask. It was understood because your neighbor would enforce it on you. The social norms are in such a way. And that's just, sometimes the social norms help and sometimes they might be also make it more difficult. The problem with social norms is that they don't adjust to the circumstances very quickly. Okay, so that's, so you can't change the social norms just as it is. You can change them slowly over time. So you can choose them, but only slowly over time. Other things like how the government enforces it and things like that, you can choose much more quickly. The other thing where you can make the society more resilient is by having a particular reaction to shocks. And that was where this adverse feedback loop came into play, where I showed these feedback externalities. If people react in a particular way, you can actually, make the society more resilient. A trivial example is like if you have this rush for toilet paper. So I don't know whether this happened in India as well, or some certain goods. There's a need, somebody is buying a lot of toilet paper, and then the other person feels, oh, I have to buy it too. And then the first person, I have to buy even more because the toilet paper will be gone at the end, we will be all worse off. That's one of these feedback loops. And if there's an understanding in the society, no, that's not morally correct, or that's not the right thing to do, but then actually you as a society, you're much more resilient. While you might think as an individual, you might just rush for the toilet papers to make yourself more resilient against the shock. But the reaction function, and we can choose this reaction function. I think there's a choice to it. It's not given there. So the second part of your question was more about finance or capital markets versus the real economy. And there, I must say, India depends a lot on the global financial cycle. So whether the Indian stock market or the Indian economy is doing well depends to a large extent also what the US Federal Reserve is deciding. So in March 2020, what happened is there was huge capital outflows from all emerging economies. And it looked like the whole thing is falling apart. And then the Fed intervened very aggressively. So it was an active choice by the Federal Reserve and also by other central banks to really stabilize the situation. So it is a choice, and you can make a difference. If you make the wrong policies, then the whole thing will fall apart. So how resilient the whole system is depends on the reactions of key institutions, and that's why we need institutions which take this into account and have a good understanding of this resilience in order to make resilience happen. But it is an active choice. And then the final question is, why are the financial markets doing so phenomenally well while the real economy is not doing so well? I mean, there's still a challenge out there. We have all the supply shortages and who knows what. And that is a puzzle to some extent. But one can explain it to say, okay, it seems like the market thinks this will be a 1, 2, 3 year thing, and then it will be over. And if I look at the stock market, it prices the value of the cash flows for the next 50 years now. So just having no dividends for 1 or 2 years is not a big deal compared to the next 50 years. In particular, when the interest rate is so low, because the discount factor, so if I discount future cash flow streams and the interest rate is low, if something is far in the future, it gets a huge weight too compared to the near future. So if you think about that, so cutting down the interest rate actually offset it much more dramatically. Would you say, is there something worrisome that the markets are so high, and if you are shocked by high interest rate in the US, and this might happen, and this might have huge implications for India and other emerging economies, that's worrisome. So you better would build up now some buffers now. Now it's cheap to issue equity or issue long-term debt instead of short-term debt. Let's build up the buffers now, in particular in emerging economies, such that if there's a shock that we are buffered and don't have this adverse feedback loops kicking in.
So this mention of buffers actually leads me to a follow-up question, and that's also about resilience. So you've talked about redundancies, right? So which helps to sort of make us resilient.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if this sort of ties resilience with affluence to some extent. So if there is a lot of resources available, there is always going to be a better chance for a society to be more resilient. So does it follow that always richer countries are going to be more resilient than less developed countries?
So indeed, so redundancies and buffers are very important for resilience. They're also very important for robustness. There's a big difference between the two. If you want a robust system, you have for each shock, you have a particular buffer, because you want to withstand all the shocks. You don't even give in. resilience means you have some flexible redundancies. So whenever there's a shock, you might be hit and then you have to figure out what to do, but you have some buffers to fall back on and you have to re-optimize the buffer to work for this particular shock. Okay, so you don't have redundancies for each particular shock. So one analogy I use in the book is also that if you have a skyscraper, you know, the skyscraper is going to wind back and forth quite a bit. So you could make the skyscraper in theory, you know, stand very rigid all the time. But then you need so many redundancies, so many extra weights that the skyscraper would fall on its own weight down. So it doesn't really work. So we have to have some buffers, but not too many, such that we can actually then we need flexible redundancies. So or flexible buffers, which we can redeploy. But you make an important point in a sense that you know, you have to be able to afford these redundancies. And if you're poor and very poor, you just simply can't afford it. And this way, there is a connection. That's also a connection to the poverty trap, you know, where you say, okay, if people are sufficiently poor and they cannot afford to have some things lying out there idle, in just in case if something happens, they have some resources. And that's where, you know, at the individual level, there will be poor people who have to suffer from the poverty trap. That you know, society has to, and the government has to help out and say, okay, if somebody is hit by a big shock, we help out. So we have to have some basic social insurance system to help out. And what it means is not necessarily that you just throw money at people, but you probably throw some help at them and you do some reskilling and others if somebody loses a job. So it should, the worst thing is, you know, if there's a bad harvest, a bad crop, and then, you know, a farmer has to take out his kids from the school, and the next generation will suffer from that too. And this is, you know, that's a trap. It's a poverty trap. You can't come back out. So the government and society should help out in this regard. But from at the country level, then it's all the case that wealthier countries can, of course, afford much more support than not so wealthy countries. And there's an additional challenge there. And we don't have, you know, at the global level, some insurance schemes that if the whole country is hit, then the global institutions will help out as well. Perhaps we want to go in that way as well. So we have, through international global institutions, some, you know, if there's a liquidity shock, then the IMF is coming in and gives you cheap lending, often attached with certain strings. But then we have some of it, but it's very small compared to the scale of the macroeconomy. But you're right, it's more challenging to build a resilient society for less affluent ones. But you can also see that sometimes societies are very affluent, but the institutions are so weak, it doesn't help them either. So it's not guaranteed. Being wealthy is not guaranteed that you're resilient.
So sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was, you know, since you were talking about resilience and what societies need to have in terms of institutions, I think during the pandemic, what we all experience is like, you know, technology really helped the global societies become more resilient. And you know, the way we are having these conversations and conferences and learning and, you know, the work's going on in a totally digital mode. So technology did help, you know, to connect people across the globe when we were practicing social distancing to curtail the spread of the virus. And we did see that there are many tech companies which benefited from this, you know, adoption of technology. And on one side, we saw a lot of tech companies actually bettering their bottom lines and actually advancing, you know, growing their businesses. But on the other hand, we also had many people, especially, you know, the migrant class in India, and people at the bottom of the pyramid who were really hard hit and were terribly hit. So what we were trying to understand is that are the inequalities, you know, brought in by this pandemic kind of different from the, you know, the previous 14th century pandemic that we faced, the Black Death pandemic? Or how do you think the inequalities are going to move? Or how will they be different?
Yes, very interesting question. It's more than one question. Let me try to approach them one by one. Yeah, so let me first say, I think I was, you know, my in-laws, they live in India, and there was a lot of support by the society the Delta variant hit, and neighborhoods were sharing food, and you went to the shopkeeper, he didn't charge you for the food. So there was a lot of support. And this was really a great sign of a great society, essentially, to help each other out. The whole neighborhoods were sticking together and supporting each other. And that's that really makes a huge difference to society. And I think that's something to cherish and really praise and this way. But then there's the second component is the technology. And I totally agree. So the technology allowed us to handle this pandemic way better than we would have done even 10 years ago. So that's a big plus. And you might argue, okay, but certain technology companies benefited from that as well. It's fine. If somebody does something and it helps society, if the benefits on top of it, that's fine as well. I think so. As long as not exploited, so if somebody is not exploiting the weakness of others and is still helping and supporting and make the situation better, I'm not opposed to that. Somebody else is then making a lot of money too. Ultimately, everybody has to give it back to society down the road when we go to a different situation. So that's one thing. So that's my take, and I think I really agree that the Corona crisis, so the fact that it came now, and then we had a lot of this technology, it helped a lot. And it also gave a boost to develop the technology even further. So that's another thing. So the whole digitalization movement was actually boosted by probably 5, 6 years across the globe. And I think that's very, very important. Now you mentioned the other aspect is the inequality aspect, and you mentioned the migrant class and all that. So what's interesting about India is, of course, that if you look at these externalities, in India, the coronavirus, the COVID came first through the airports to the big cities, to the wealthy, and then the migrant workers, helpers and all this. And then, when the lockdown happened, then it traveled through the migrant workers, traveled into the countryside. So you could really see how the spreading was working and how the externalities happened. So I described this in the book, how I think India was probably the clearest case, and that where you see comes through the big cities, through people flying in through airports, the wealthy get exposed, and then the less wealthy get exposed, then to the lockdown, they move to the countryside, and then the whole virus moves with them into the countryside as well. And there is, of course, resilience and inequality, as we talked earlier. So poor people have much less resilience. But there's also inequality not only in wealth, or the different inequality concepts. So one is inequality in income. So some people get more income than others, and inequality in wealth, which is more a stock level inequality. But the book that makes a new concept of inequality in resilience. So there's some people who are more resilient than others, and that feeds into the other inequalities. So if I'm very resilient, then I can take on more risk. And because I know if something happens, I can bounce back from that. If I take on more risk, I take on a business and I make more profits from this because I can take on this risk. I get the higher earnings from taking on this risk. I get a risk premium. And this way I will be in the long run get more income, and I also get more wealth. So in the end, the fact that there was an inequality in resilience, it will translate in income inequality and in wealth inequality. And then you made this analogy to the Black Death. In Europe, where a third of the population died, and I would say the Corona crisis or COVID crisis, it was not less dramatic than the Black Death, because not a third of the population died. I mean, it's pretty bad as it is, but so some analogies are often made. So what happened after Black Death is that it really changed to a radical rethinking of people and also of wages. Also, suddenly we had this feudal system in Europe, at least. Then there was, some duke who was in charge, and then there were the farmers and the peasants who had very little to say. And suddenly there were no peasants around anymore. And somehow people were thinking different. So there was a shortage of labor, and the value of land went down while the wage rate went up. So it changed the power arrangement in that time. And then people argued that also people's attitude changed towards, what's the meaning of life? I'm dying, see, 1/3 is my neighbor died and my kids die and all this. So you have a total attitude change of about life, and you value other things more, spiritual things more, and also the art and all this. Some people even argue that the Medicis and all this, the holy movement in the Middle Ages through the Renaissance was actually to some extent triggered. So that's a claim. So I don't know whether that's true. Was triggered by the Black Death. So what do I see now? I think the current situation, we won't say, we see labor shortages. Now we see wages going up, at least in the US. I wouldn't say it's not so dramatic as in the Black Death, but there is an attitude change as well among people. So what's the meaning of life? So many people were just working and commuting hours, and then they stayed at home, lockdown, they stayed at home, said, oh, it's pretty nice at home, working from home remotely. And suddenly they have a different attitude to that. Do I need to this extra $1 or extra $10 or just stay at home with my kids? So there's a slightly shift, and the willingness to work has changed to some extent. And that's what we see in the labor participation rate. So if you look at in the US, people are not coming back at the same level as they were working in beforehand. So there are some similarities, much less dramatic as the Black Death, but I think there are some similarities there.
Okay.
Can I make a comment about this observation that, and in fact, you make this comparison towards the end of the book with Black Death. So first of all, so when this pandemic actually started, it started by affecting the most affluent people for some reason. So only people who had access to airplanes and air travel were perhaps the first people to actually get affected. And perhaps for that reason, initially, we also saw, I don't know, at least in the stock markets, for example, a lot of wealth just vanished within a few days. So there was some effect on inequality, but maybe that has been reversed, and maybe it's going to go completely in the opposite direction after we're completely done with it. So I was just wondering if there is maybe if we can think about the effect on society for pandemics which were perhaps not as strong as the Black Death. Something like, for example, the Spanish flu pandemic, which I think hit early 20th century. Do we know any sort of labor market effects or distributional effects of something like that? Are there any studies or anything like that?
No sound, okay, please.
So some people have worked on the labor market aspects on the Spanish flu, but I haven't studied that. So the problem is we don't have so many episodes, I mean, where we have the pandemics coming, and often they're far in the past, so we don't have really good data. So at that time, we didn't really keep track of the unemployment numbers the same way we do today. So anything has to be taken with a grain of salt. So I know that, when the Black Death was so dramatic, then people can draw even if you don't have, very precise data, you can make conclusions because it's just a dramatic shift. For the Spanish flu, I don't know. Of course, it was also the end of the First World War, so the soldiers came back. So it was a huge change in the labor market anyway. So it's much harder to figure out, because on the one hand, you have, in certain countries, they lost the war. In certain countries, they won the war, and all the soldiers came back. So you have to integrate them in the workforce again. And then you have the Spanish flu on top of it. So I'm not aware of the numbers. So somebody has to look it up, perhaps send us an email and saying, oh, that's what the study is. But I can't point to one at the moment. But it's a good point.
Great. So also, towards the end in the later half of the book, in the fourth part, you've written about the breakdowns of the supply chain and value chain.
Yeah.
So as you said, that technology did show the resilience, helped us stay connected and work from home, but there was a supply chain breakdown, and people had to source stuff more locally. So do you think that due to pandemic, there is a more deglobalization happening? Whereas, on the other hand, technology has helped us stay connected. We are connected to you,
Yes.
uh, with a great distance. So, what do you think? What frameworks and how can we have a more connected economy so that we don't get into deglobalization because of the breakdown of supply chain? What frameworks could we have around there?
Yeah. So essentially, there are several aspects to it. So it's indeed there's a threat at the moment that there will be deglobalization. This will hurt the emerging economies quite a bit, and I think they should be aware of that. The sense is that in many advanced economies there was too much outsourcing to save labor costs. You just produce it and ship it, and this caused all this lack of resilience. And the two responses to it. One response is just, as you mentioned, is so-called reshoring. So we just bring it back to the advanced economies and we produce there. And that will hurt actually the emerging economies quite a bit if everything is moved back. It also means that there will be high inflation in the advanced economies because the labor costs will be higher. But the political mood is actually this way to not have these open borders. Let's do much more reshoring, boost up the labor at home in the advanced economies. And that's a threat for the emerging economies. There's an alternative answer. The alternative answer is, in order to get more resilience, instead of outsourcing to one country and two companies in one country, we do so-called multi-sourcing. So we outsource it to 3-4 companies in different continents. So if there's a little outbreak of something in one country, then this company will not be able to deliver and supply our chips or whatever it is. But the other country, I have outsourced something to China, something to India, something to Latin America. So there is some safety there, some redundancy there, because I can scale up in Latin America if something goes wrong in China, let's say. And this way I can also be resilient. And that's actually a more efficient way to be resilient rather than just bringing everything back. But the political mood is different. The companies probably would go for the multi-sourcing approach. And one has to find a balance on these two things. Then as on top of it, there comes the whole debate on climate change, which also will lead probably to higher tariffs that might actually damage the whole thing. So that's one aspect. So that's in particular for goods, physical goods, which you have to move. But we see a big revolution also in terms of services. And that's where your point comes in, Professor Asrani. So it's essentially that you can actually now much more easily outsource services. No, we always had call centers in India, but now, I can have a consultant coming from doing certain services, or have a communications department sitting somewhere in a different country, or at least far away. So the dimension or the abilities to outsource is way better now when we're all in this virtual world, and we don't have to be physically in the same place. And there would be way more competition as long as you have smart, well-educated citizens who can provide services. And if there's shortage of labor in an advanced economy, is it the next thing you do? You go, how can we do this in some other country? And we have some well-educated, smart citizens, and they can do this for us. And the distances are going away, essentially, the physical distances, because we can do it virtually. And that's, I think, I see the potential that this will scale up, while the trade focused on physical goods will be under threat to some extent. But nevertheless, what people tell me is that even if you outsource, you still need physically people going there occasionally, to make a connection. And it can't be all over Zoom. So at some point we have to meet in order to make a connection.
So, Markus, you've been talking about, how technology helped us be more resilient, and we've also discussed about some parts of inequality that the pandemic has caused. Maybe it could have increased. We've also seen these impact of climate change happening. So, given that the world order is unequal, a lot of differences between developed, developing, and emerging economies, And as you said, that due to the breakdown of the global supply chain, it would be the emerging economies who will be suffering or probably, taking the brunt of it. So how do you think, when we talk about global responsibility to hedge against or hedge risk or mitigate risk against cyber attacks or climate change, how do we share responsibility in a global order?
Yeah, I think what's important, I don't think there will be a huge wealth redistribution. So that's an illusion. I think that to say, okay, the advanced economies will just say, oh, here's our wealth, take part of it. But it's more realistic to say, we will set up a system when somebody is hit by a shock, then we will help out. So it's essentially just, and help out that you can bounce back. And we will give you guidance, to some extent material guidance, but also guidance in advice and institutional frameworks and all of this. And I think that's probably the more likely outcome to find an international order where, we assist each other by coming back after shocks. And surprisingly, I mean, the media helps. Now, in the olden days, when I was young, let's say 20 years ago, people were not so aware there was a catastrophe in this part of the world and in that part. Now you see catastrophes everywhere, and there's an emotional attachment to it. Oh, we have to help out because it's some suffering, which goes. So essentially, what will happen is if there's a shock, there will be probably some help to overcome this and bounce back. But if it's a slow dragging thing, there's always a disaster slowly moving, then it's much more difficult to get support for that, to solve that. That will be the big challenge in the global space. And then the second thing I would like to say, what's surprising is that this was really one of the first shocks which hit all of human beings at the same time. So it was a global shock. It was not, hitting one part of the world and not the other part of the world. And typically when something is hit from outside, it is a force of unity. It forces people to work together because we all have to overcome that. So it's this famous saying, when Ronald Reagan met with Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s, and we were thinking to figure out, and Mikhail Gorbachev said, let's suppose we were to attack from Mars or from outer space, and I call you up, would you help me out? And this was during the Cold War. And then Mikhail Gorbachev said, of course, we will work together. We are all hit from outside. And we also, as human beings, we have to work together to defend ourselves. And this was like a shock, like not from outside, but, hitting everybody. And it was not well, then there was all these different things, everybody was thinking about their own national interest. The coordination didn't work so well. So we have to work on the institutional arrangements, global institutional arrangements, to make sure if we hit from outside by a global shock, we should work together to figure this out and not put national interest first. I think that's, one thing to really take into account in the future. How do we have to change the institutional framework to make sure that we all, when we have a common shock, everything will channel things so that we can also jointly work against it and not work against each other, essentially.
Can I ask one other question? So this is again derived from reading about certain concepts in your book and trying to apply that to our situation back home. So this is about the importance of social contracts, and so I can understand how important this is, especially for resilience. Social contracts, of course, serve so many other different purposes as well. Now, I really liked the small diagram that you had with the triangle where there were these 3 points, which are government and society, and the other one is markets, right?
Yes.
And we are placed somewhere in the middle where different institutions are enforcing social contracts to different extents. So again, my question, so then I was wondering basically about what the situation is in India. So definitely I can't claim that the government is very strong here. At the same time, the market institutions market, of course, is present, but it's a mixed sort of system, and also the efficiency of the markets here may be questioned from certain angles. One of the things that we perhaps could try to claim that when we think about society itself, it would possibly be more, it would make sense to me to sort of think that in our country we have slightly better social enforcement of I can't claim that most of the time people are enforcing the correct thing or the right thing, but whatever they're enforcing, it just seems to me that the social enforcement mechanisms are stronger here, right? So can we make any sort of a comparative judgment between where we are placed in that triangle based on what is the most important or most effective enforcement mechanism for social contracts? Is there a better way to do this or a worse way to do this?
So I agree with you. So essentially, there's a mix. You have social norms, you have governments, and you have the market, and then there's optimal. So you ask me, is there an absolute optimal mix to pick?
No. So let me clarify. So I don't think that there would be an optimum, but based on how the society or the economy is, there must be an for that country, there could be a better way or worse way, and specifically depending on the strength of these enforcement mechanisms. So in certain cases, market institutions may not be that developed yet, right? So
I agree. So there are two ways to improve things. So you can say, okay, I can, out of these three, I can improve each of the three. That's already improving, or I can just, when I dot these in this triangle, I shift more towards the social enforcement because it works better in my country. So that's very country specific. It depends on the history, culture of the country, and that's very hard to judge in the abstract. One has to, but there's also a rivalry. So if I have, social enforcement works really well and people help each other, and then I have a very aggressive government coming in and does a lot of subsidies and help out a lot, I compete away essentially the social enforcement, which works on its own. So one has to be careful on this, about this dimension too. My leaning is a little bit, if it works on its own from a society perspective, you let it work on a society perspective on its own. You don't intervene as a government. But if it doesn't work, then you might have to intervene as a government. But that once you intervene, you might crowd out and it might never develop the social self-enforcement. But the point also I wanted to make in the book is that the optimal point or the optimal mix might shift over time. So when you go into a pandemic, you suddenly, it becomes, markets might not work so well, and you have to really, markets might work well in the vaccine developments because they're more innovative and all that, but they might, in certain dimension, might not work so well. So you have more externalities suddenly, and the government has to intervene more radically because of that. And then the question is, when the pandemic recedes again and goes away, will you move back again? So it's a little bit, I don't think it's part of the book anymore, but let me just tell you the story. In the US, you have speed limits. So I'm from Germany originally. We don't have speed limits on the Autobahn. And, but then the speed limits were introduced in the 1970s because of the high oil price. And then when the oil price came down, the speed limits were not removed anymore. And here's a little bit with the pandemic. So with the pandemic, makes sense that the government has more power to enforce, to make sure the externalities thing is. But when the pandemic goes away, is society strong enough, or is the social contract resilient enough that then the power of the government recedes again as well with the pandemic? And I think that's important, that that you don't see this as a pandemic and there's a power grab by the government, and then when the pandemic is over, the power allocation is now different. So a resilient society is open to adjusting how much power, let's say, the government has, But it also, when the danger goes away, it also goes back to the old format again. So that's I think what the social contract in a bigger scale is resilient if it allows for flexibility and is not subject to power grabs by one of the 3 points I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Chavi, should we take some questions? If you have any questions from the audience, let me just check.
Yeah, I think we will, open for audience question, and I do have a couple of questions coming. So 2 questions have come in now from the JGU students. One question. So yeah, they are very concerned that their university learning is going in an online mode, and for them the teaching has been completely online. So this has been a scenario for 2 years. So they keep on hearing a lot of discussions about how with the advent of the digital revolution, the skill set required for the workforce is going to change in the future.
Yes.
So do you think that this online learning, this university teaching being held in an online mode would prepare the future workforce in apt ways, because that's going to be the future of work? So is online learning preparing the human resource well for the future of work?
So there are 2 aspects to online learning. So one is it's very powerful. You can give advanced education to people in remote villages you couldn't do before. So I think there's huge positive benefits from online learning, and I'm a big proponent for promoting that. So there's a poor child somewhere in the middle of the countryside and has suddenly access to some YouTube or whatever it is, and can learn things. And if you're curious, you have so much opportunities these days which you didn't have 20 or 30 years ago. And that's really important. So we should bring the internet to the countryside and all that, and have online learning. That's a good sign. The other thing is what we have learned essentially at university education or school education is that a lot of this learning happens between the students. So if everybody is sitting on the computer just watching Zoom, it's not the same. Because when I have a class here, in-person class, the students, they might even chat during my lecture. But even afterwards, I say, I didn't understand that. And then the other students said, no, it was like this. And that is tremendously valuable. And you don't get this on Zoom. It happened to me that, when you ask the students at the end of the course, do you know each other? No, they didn't even know each other. No, they saw each other's pictures, but they didn't communicate. And so the learning, when you go together for dinner then, and then talk about the class and all this, and that's all missing. That's a big component of learning. So I don't think at the very high level, this will drive out physical in-person learning, but it will give additional opportunities for people who had not access to this type of learning anyway. That's actually a good additional element to have. So that's one thing about online learning. Now, what's really important, what we have learned is these days, it's very hard to learn for 50 years what you will do later on. So you have to be constantly learning. Even if on the job, you should watch, be curious and try to learn all the time. Come back to university or attend certain classes in the evenings and all this. That's very important. So to have a general level of curiosity and a general level of broad education so you can actually easily move around. The flexibility, I think, is very important. And I think the biggest skill set is essentially to be flexible, and you can move around from one area to another area. I'm not sure whether it's wise. Of course, you can say I become a coder and I know how to code. There might be an artificial intelligence way of coding in the future, and suddenly, so you should be more generally educated, and also be able, so generally educated, but also dive deep in particular areas. But be able to, then if this area doesn't work anymore, you can get out of it, move to another area and dive in deep as well. So that's, I think, that's my philosophy. And online education allows you to stay on top of things, because even if you don't go to university, you can still watch online lectures. But the community that you do it together with others, watching online lectures together with others is very, very important. And that's a challenge a little bit.
I think we'll have time for one last question. There's a question, or you were talking about capital markets and how they were very different from the real economy. So there is a student question that they're asking that, in India during the pandemic, we had really high levels of unemployment touching around 23% during the peak. But, in 2020, in 2021, we saw a lot of IPOs coming in. So, is there like a disconnect between the stock market's performance and how the real economy is working? So, on one side, there is unemployment, but the financial markets are still very positive.
No, essentially, the central banks were flooding the market with liquidity. So that's why there's a disconnect, and it was intentional. So because the real economy would have done even worse if the central banks would not have flooded the market with liquidity. So that's this whole SPACs developments and the IPO waves, which came during the Corona crisis. How can this be? The real economy is suffering, and suddenly there's this new IPO waves. But it's because the central banks were just flooding the economy with money, and everybody was sitting on a ton of money, and there was all this additional speculation. You probably have heard about this Robin Hood and all these things. People were sitting, they got stimulus checks, they were sitting on money and let me speculate on some IPO and things like that. So there was a lot of additional money floating around, and you couldn't spend it on going to restaurants. And that led to some artificial things, but people would say, yeah, let's do this because we don't want to shut down companies. Anyway, many companies will go down. We want to limit and make funding very easy available. Typically in a regular economy, we want this Darwinian selection, that the bad companies don't get funding and they will weave out, and the good companies get funding, the productive, and they dominate the economy. And new entrants come in and all this. There's constant turnover to get the productive companies going, and the bad companies, less productive ones, they have to leave the marketplace. Now, the policy measure was, let's not do that, because if you don't do anything, then most companies have to leave. So let's just flood the market with, we allow all companies as much as we can to flourish, even if they're not productive. Of course, it creates problems down the road because we have a lot of non-productive companies which are not weaved out. So we have, at some point, this will come, this awakening will come. It's like, oh, now we have all these companies, these less productive companies. Yeah, they have to go bankrupt in order to make place to more productive companies. And that will be the challenge. But there is a disconnect, but it was to some extent a political choice, or to a large extent.
Thank you, Professor Markus.
Thank you.
Professor Amlan, do we invite Trisha? Yeah.
I think we are completely out of time now, so we will have to end this session, unfortunately, but it was turning out to be a very fascinating discussion. I would have loved to continue with this. But I just wanted to congratulate you on this book, and it was an amazing journey to go through it, and it is some of the most fascinating ideas. Really changed the way I was thinking about various things. And of course, please, whenever you are visiting India next time, please just come to our campus to visit us, and we'd love to host you in Sonipat when you are here next.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, and thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. And the Indian edition of the book is, I think, only coming out in March by HarperCollins, but it was great to talk it through with you, and I hope I can come in person soon, and then we can continue the discussion.
Yes, that will be wonderful, Professor. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye. So this was the last session of day 2, and to close this session, I'm going to invite one of our students, our student Trishna Nair, to please come and do the closing.
Good evening, Professor. Am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
All right. A very good evening to one and all. I'm Trishna S. Nair, a second-year BCom honors student and the Cultural Secretary of the Student Council at the Jindal School of Banking and Finance. I would like to start off by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to the esteemed speakers and panelists that spared their valuable time for the Global Finance Conclave. As a student of finance and a young investor, these sessions have almost been like a very enriching extension of my course and an absolute treat overall. On day one of the conclave, we kicked off with sessions around our theme of India's growth story. Today, that is day two, we dove into various dimensions of finance in multiple sessions in the form of panel discussions, paper presentations, and distinguished public lectures. Each of these sessions addressed ideas and issues around consumer behavior, policy formulation, and regulation with respect to the prevailing Indian economic structure. There was also some optimistic views expressed regarding the positive future outcomes of decisions that have been made and are being made by various parties within the economy. With this, we come to an end of the academic speaker sessions. Tomorrow, the final day of the conclave, we have a lineup of student-led events. These events have been curated around finance, marketing, economics, and logical reasoning. Following this will be the valedictory session. We have participants from various esteemed universities all over the country. We expect to see some rigorous and interesting debates and presentation of ideas. We truly hope that you will join us for the final day 3 events tomorrow. I thank Professor Ram and Professor Amlan for giving me the opportunity to present my closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Trishna. Shubham, we can go off air now.